So in this video, I'm going to talk about auctions and I'm going to talk about intellectual property. Both are relevant for our entrepreneur in a couple different ways. So firstly, maybe our entrepreneur is founding some type of auction app or something. Probably not so likely, but instead probably the place where it'd be most relevant for our entrepreneur from the standpoint of either bidding on jobs and projects, maybe through the government or something like that, local government, or from the standpoint of being able to acquire used quality capital to be able to make the business or be able to launch the business in the first place. And so one example of this that I like to give is this clip from Washington. So there's a supermarket that had gone out of business, former supermarket auction, good for entrepreneurs. Why? Because like suppose you're founding a bakery or something, you need the bakery display, glass display cases. This looks like maybe, I don't know, it's like cheese or something or produce, and then you've got these shelves. So all this is up for auction. And my favorite part of this video, so I show this in class, my favorite part of the video is Sally, Sally doesn't know how auctions work or how grocery stores gone out of business work. Sally's gonna walk along and Sally's gonna grab this fire extinguisher. Sally, that's not how it works. No, you can't. That's not how it works. Okay, so there's Sally. All right, good. So that was this clip right here. We think about auctions, and we think about auctions as an interesting mechanism for allocating products in economics in general. Firstly, because there's some interesting economic theory behind it. Secondly, because, well, I mean, it's significant. This is approximately 10% of GDP is exchanged through auctions. There's a lot of examples, internet auctions, so there's like consumer auctions through like eBay, for example. There's also business to business auctions in the sense of like, General Motors, the auto auctions, and some other types of situations where we'd encounter auctions. And so it's significant and it's worth considering. What I'm going to do in these slides is I'm going to talk about kind of conceptually how the auctions work. We could go into way more theory here. Like this is, there's I had a PhD theory course entirely structured around different types of auctions. And so it's really interesting, but we're not going to go into that level here. Here, we're just going to be interested in thinking about like conceptually how these things work. That's going to be enough for our entrepreneur to kind of understand what's going on. All right, so in terms of examples, there's a lot of examples of like government related auctions. So in the sense of like selling off assets, like when moving from public holdings to privatization, one of the kind of key ways that these assets are going to be allocated are via auctions. There's a couple of reasons why. Treasury bills, T-bills, for monetary policy. Mineral rights from the standpoint of, are you able to buy the rights to oil fields or timber, especially like on public lands or something like this. The electromagnetic spectrum is an interesting one, especially recently with some unused portion of spectrum being auctioned off in the past couple of years. Construction contracts, of course. When I was working, I typically in college worked for the same amusement park that I'd worked for in high school. But for 3 seasons, I worked for the Department of Public Works, and my job was basically to clean the oil spots off of the parking garage. And there was decaying concrete that had to be replaced. And each summer there was an outfit from a different state. I think most recently, the last time I was there is like from Kentucky. And I was always wondering, like, how is this firm from Kentucky, this construction firm from Kentucky, redoing the concrete in Green Bay, Wisconsin's parking garage as well? They'd won the government contract to be able to, they'd won the bid to be able to do that work. Other examples, well, there's auction houses. I actually lived down the street from an auction house in Green Bay. Electricity markets, real estate auctions, foreclosures, so on and so forth. And definitely used cars from the standpoint of either public auctions or General Motors, like used car auctions between their individual lots. All right, so thinking about auctions, well, there's auctions to sell, like auctions to sell off particular assets, auctions to buy, like bidding on contracts and buying the rights to do that work. One of the questions we might ask is like why the seller might use the auction rather than setting a price. Well, suppose the price isn't known, or suppose like we have very heterogeneous consumers. Well, the problem is this imperfect information, right? Coming up with the correct price requires knowledge about buyers' valuations. And especially if you just have like one item to sell, you're not going to be able to do surveys or try to figure out like what's people's willingness to pay. Instead, you can elicit these valuations through the auction mechanism. The basic idea is auctions allow the sellers to extract large amounts of surplus without knowing specifically what are the buyer's valuations. If you've got the auction constructed correctly, the mechanism itself will lead to this result. That's the idea. We have a lot of different types of auctions. I'll talk about those, and I'll talk about like the relationships between them. And the type of auction ultimately affects two things. Firstly, the optimal bidding strategy. Secondly, the optimal choice of the auction design for the seller. So the bidding strategy for bidders is going to be dependent on the type of auction. Also, depending on the type of the auction, it's going to influence like which is the one that's most appropriate given the situation that we've got for our seller. All right, so I'll think about firstly two simple auction formats: a first price sealed bid auction and a second price sealed bid auction. Sealed bid just means that everybody's not going to see what are the bids. Only the seller is, and then they're going to select either the highest price or the second highest price. And then in either case, like whoever wins the auction, whoever has the highest valuation gets the object. There's a key difference though. So like for the first price sealed bid auction, for instance, suppose we're putting bids in envelopes. We're giving these to the seller at the same time. The high bidder wins the item at the amount they bid. In the second price sealed bid auction, everyone's putting their bids in the envelopes, giving them to the seller at the same time. And the difference is the highest bidder wins the item at the amount that the second highest bidder bid, which is interesting. And you can think about how this could lead to some interesting problems, especially if there's a wide gap between the high bidder and the next highest bidder. You can Google this. There's an interesting example with Spectrum Auctions from New Zealand. It was a great debacle where the high bidder, they use a second price sealed bid auction, and the high bidder's valuation was like an order of magnitude higher than, maybe several orders of magnitude higher than the next highest bidder. So they essentially got the Spectrum at this deep discount from the standpoint of what the public was aware of. Anyway, so that's an interesting internet rabbit hole to go down. All right, so in terms of other types of variants of auctions, well, we have the difference between if we have a private value auction, if we have a common value auction. The idea with a private value auction is everybody's got a different idiosyncratic valuation for the item, and bidder I, person I's surplus from winning is going to be whatever is their valuation minus the price that they've paid. The common value auction, everybody's got the same valuation for the item. They have a different signal as to what that valuation actually is. So this is the type of thing where whatever is the item's the same value to me as it is to you, and I've got a different belief about what that actually might be. I don't know. So an example of this would be, you hear stories about art auctions, or like somebody goes to a rummage sale and sees this item and recognizes it as being super valuable, and then they go and resell it. It's that kind of that type of thing where you have something where the value is going to be sort of external to the buyer themselves, and therefore it's not very subjective. But each individual does have this subjective signal as to what that value is. Another good example would be like timber rights or mineral rights, where there's some value for the lumber on the side of a mountain, and firms are going to make a bid bidding to the rights as to being able to extract that lumber and then sell it. And you'll have a different information signal about like what are the costs going to be necessary to extract that lumber, like how rugged is the land or something like that. Same thing with like oil. And so we have the type of idea here we're thinking of is where we've got a common value. Everybody's got ultimately it's going to be the same value to everybody, but people have different beliefs, different signals as to what that value is. All right. Clearly, the common value auction and the individual private value auction are polar extremes. Most auctions are going to have like some components of each, right? So in most auctions, there's going to be a common and a private component. We can talk about like kind of the extremes at one end or the other. There's no like really good examples of like purely private. I mean, it's just kind of like perfect competition and monopoly. There's not a whole lot of like good examples of perfect competition. There's not a whole lot of examples of monopoly. There's things kind of that are close. So you think of like utilities are a pretty good example of like a monopoly. Think of like agricultural goods are a pretty good example of perfect competition, but they're not perfect. It's kind of like this, where we have like some things are a pretty good example of common value auction. Some are pretty good examples of individual private value auctions. There's ultimately some portion of both at play. So you could think of something that shades a little bit closer to like a private value auction. So you could think of, maybe there's a collectible where there's actually not going to be resale. So, I think back to items I had when I was a kid, and I might want to scour eBay and try to find those items. It's not because I'm going to turn around and sell it to somebody else, but it's because it's got a valuation to me because of those memories as a child, right? So collectibles where there's no resale, right? It's a different thing. So if we're thinking about collectibles with a high valuation of resale, then that would be the opposite. That'd be like the common value auction. Internet impression auctions, construction procurement auctions where there's little uncertainty over the nature of the product, right? Where everybody knows exactly like what are the costs to extract the timber. Now, like I said, that was my example from before. If there was a lot of uncertainty about the nature of the product, now it flips and now it becomes closer to a common value auction. So something that's closer to a common value auction like oil or timber, anything where the resale is actually likely, but the market conditions could change. So you think of like T-bills, NCAA tournament auctions, and so on and so forth. All right, so I'll talk about some of the bidding strategies. Remember we said like the type of auction influences the bidding strategy. It also influences like the choice of the auction for our seller. And so I'll go over those things, and those are going to be kind of the quintessential ideas we want to pull out of this lecture. So for the second price seal bid auction, it's actually a weakly dominant strategy to bid truthfully, to submit a bid that is your true value, right? And then in equilibrium, well, the high value bidder wins the object at the valuation of the second highest bidder. And the idea is you're going to win exactly when you want to win, and you're going to lose exactly when you want to lose. In any situation, this is why this is an equilibrium. If you would bid above your own strategy, now you could have a situation where you're winning when you'd rather lose. If you're bidding below your true value, you could be losing when you'd rather win. And so it actually turns out that that the dominant strategy is truth telling. You should just bid your true value. Same thing in medical residencies. Like if you're submitting, I spoke with Al Roth briefly. I was at Pitt, and he gave a talk about having won the Nobel Prize. And again, there's a truth-telling mechanism for matching markets, assigning medical residencies to medical students. And the idea is truth-telling. And I was having a conversation about this with my brother, who's a physician, who's going into the matching market. And Al Roth's advice was he's got to tell the truth. He's got to say he's got to give his true preferences, which, I mean, everybody knows that. So anyway, for the first price seal bid auction, now you don't want to bid your true value. You actually want to shade your valuation. Why? Well, shading here, we're thinking about some value kind of below your true valuation. You want to shade your bid downwards towards your true valuation. And the idea here is to give yourself surplus. If you bid your true value in a first price auction and win, you're the high bidder, you win zero. Right? So you want to bid a little bit less than your true value so that you have some surplus. Now, you don't have that problem in the second price seal bid auction, because if you bid your value, you're not paying that price. If you're the high price bidder, you're paying the next person's value. And so that's why there is surplus without shading in the second price auction. Shading, this is like there's a complicated mathematical derivation of what this is. That's kind of like, we don't need to worry about that unless you're doing like the PhD theory, but the basic idea is you have some expectation, some anticipation about like what other people are going to do, what the competitors' valuations are, what their information is, and that influences like how much you want to shade, how aggressively you want to shade. In equilibrium, the high valuation bidder wins the object at their shaded amount. I mean, imagine, so suppose, like I was telling the story about, I live down the street from an auction house. So suppose I go there and suppose I'm there and like, amongst the audience, I see like not everybody seems to be like sports fans. And I see like a Marshall Faulk rookie card, which I had when I was a kid. I traded it for graveyard slushes at the lunch table. But suppose I see a Marshall Faulk rookie card, and it's like a bunch of people who are clearly not sports fans and don't know what the valuation is. Like, how much do I bid for that card if I want to go and try to turn around and sell it on eBay or something? Well, I'm going to bid a lot lower than if I believe that there's like people who know what the card might be worth. Or, you know, like what's like the famous like baseball card, like Honus Wagner or something. So suppose, you know, you have something, you can tell the other people are not very sophisticated. They're unlikely to recognize the same value you have. Well, you're going to bid lower than if you believe that you are in real competition with the other bidders, right? All right. So, all right, in terms of our common value auction, what's the optimal strategy? Well, it's not optimal to bid one's valuation in either case. The problem is this winner's curse. Right? The problem is the winner's curse. So what's the winner's curse? Well, we'll explore this by virtue of an example. So suppose we're thinking about bidding for an oil block. We've got 5 companies that are bidding in a one-time sealed bid auction. the top bid gets the block at either the highest bid or the second highest bid. So I'm going to remain agnostic about is this a first price or a second price auction. I'm going to explain the winner's curse the same either way. So the true amount of oil in the field is going to be this X true. No bidder knows exactly what that is. It's going to be revealed. They're going to drill after they get the rights to drill. Each bidder is going to get their own consultant to give an expert estimate. So the oil experts can estimate the reserves with some error. So for instance, these are the estimates: the true plus 4, the true value plus 2, true value plus 0, true value minus 2, true value minus 4. The problem is you don't know which is your consultant. Even if you have like their track record and you see that they've been there's still going to be some error. Like you don't know which of these individuals is your consultant. And then the question is, given your consultant's estimate, how much will you bid, right? Well, the point here is if each bidder bids exactly their consultant's estimates, the winner is going to be whoever is the most optimistic, right? Whoever bid the true value plus 4. So the winner always loses. The winner will get the rights, but they'll have overpaid. So in general, winning in the common value auction tends to indicate your information is the most positively biased. You have the most optimistic information. So what do? To avoid the winner's curse, you have to shade down in both the first and second price auctions. You have to say, all right, if conditional on winning, I'm overbidding. Therefore, I must bid below what my estimate, what my consultant is saying it is, such that I'm hopefully preserving some level of surplus. Interestingly, the more bidders that there are, the worse the potential winner's curse is going to be, because now you have the most positive information in a larger sample, right? If you win amongst a large number of other bidders, this is telling us that you've got the most optimistic information, and so you're most likely to be subject to the winner's curse. And so the idea is, the more bidders you've got, other things equal, the more you should shade your bid. All right, so there's other auction formats we can talk about. So we've got some that are similar in terms of the strategy, in terms of design, to first and second price sealed bid auctions. So the first I'll talk about is the ascending English auction. So here our auctioneer is announcing ever increasing prices to solicit bids, and continues until there's one person left in. So you start bids low and bids rise up, and then whoever hasn't dropped out gets the item. So the idea is the bidder continues bidding until their valuation is reached, right? So once the price hits your value, well, you should leave. You shouldn't stay in the auction above your own value. So in the individual private setting, the highest bidder wins the auction at a price just above the valuation of the second highest bidder, right? So the idea is, like, when the second highest bidder, when the price reaches above their amount, they leave, and now you get the item at whatever is that price, which presumably is hopefully substantially below your price. So in some sense, this works a lot like a second price sealed bid auction. Hopefully you recognize that structure there. The other type is the descending Dutch auction. So now the auctioneer announces decreasing prices. Start high, go low, until somebody puts up their hand. So as soon as the price reaches your valuation, now you start getting anxious about, should I put my hand up? Well, not immediately, right? Because then your surplus is 0. So as the price is falling below your valuation, depending on how much you want to shade, you're going to put your hand up. If you wait too long, somebody else is going to take the item. So the idea is is that this is going to look kind of a lot like the first price case. All right, so the sealed bid auction, everybody's putting their bids in envelopes, give them to the seller at the same time, and then we saw the examples of first price versus second price. eBay has a proxy bidding system where you could tell the system your maximal bid, and then eBay's proxy bidder system will outbid the other bidders for you until your maximal bid. In the individual private valuation setting, this equilibrium should be to enter exactly your valuation for your maximal bid. So this is therefore going to look just like a second price sealed bid auction. Descending Dutch auction, so the clock announces decreasing prices till somebody puts up their hand. Bidder wins their item at the current price, right? So you definitely don't want to stop the clock when it hits your valuation. Like I was saying, 0 surplus. You wait a little bit longer, determine how much to shade, and this is going to be the same result as the first price sealed bid auction. All right. In terms of maximizing the revenue from auctions, so suppose you're the seller. Well, let's first think about an individual private auction with symmetric bidders. So so all bidders' valuations come from the same distribution, and they're risk neutral. actually the expected revenue from all the above formats. It's going to be the same. This is our revenue equivalence theorem. It's a famous result in economic theory. Problem. These assumptions probably don't all hold. So what can go wrong? Well, if bidders are risk averse, now the revenue equivalence doesn't hold. In the second price sealed bid auction and the ascending auctions, it's still optimal to bid one's valuation. However, in the first price sealed bid and in the Dutch auctions, the risk aversion makes somebody want to bid more aggressively, shade their bid less. So they're going to bid a little bit higher than they would ordinarily. With risk averse bidders, a seller does better with first price or with Dutch style auctions because of that reason. Now, what about with common values? Well, now equivalence doesn't hold. With common values, it's often optimal to use ascending auctions. Why? Well, it turns out the information that's revealed by the other bidders helps to alleviate the fears about the winner's curse and on average leading to higher bids, right? Because there's information being revealed as the price is rising. And so that can be helpful. You see that people aren't dropping out. People are staying in. This is giving you a signal about, oh, maybe the valuation is high like I think it is. There's no such auction revealed in sealed bid auctions because nobody knows the bids, or in Dutch auctions because price is coming down, and so you don't see people leaving. You don't see people leaving the auction. You're waiting for them to enter, and you don't know what point they'll do that. But with bidder asymmetry, revenue equivalence also doesn't hold. For instance, suppose bidders know that there's one very strong bidder with a really high valuation, right? So if I go to like the local auction house and people recognize that I know something about sports memorabilia and nobody else does, now all of a sudden this is going to affect their bidding. Same thing for like any other situation. If if there's a prominent collector, or if there's some, however is the case, if there's one very strong bidder who has a high valuation, now you kind of might defer to that individual. In second price or ascending auctions, the weak bidders may not even bother, right? Which is bad for the seller because nobody's competing up the price. You're essentially just selling it at whatever is the valuation of that one high bidder. Ideally, you'd want them to be like several high bidders, right? In first price or Dutch auctions, the weak bidders might actually have a better chance of winning because, well, the strong bidder might miscalculate how much to shade. So they might not, especially in the descending auction, they might not jump in or whatever is the case. So, all right. With the first price and Dutch auctions, this can promote more entry, which is generally good for the seller. Why? Because with the second price or with the ascending auction, people are kind of hesitant to get into the auction. Other issues. Well, if the seller's not well trusted by the bidders, the second price sealed bid auction can be a problem because you might worry about fake second bids, right? So I've got the high bid and they're going to set the price epsilon below that price and try to fully extract surplus from me. And that's the worry if you don't trust the seller. The other thing is like the idea of bidding fever. So there's a lot of evidence that suggests that when bidders are in a position to win, they behave somewhat irrationally. If they lose that position, they tend to try to overbid to get back. And so then ascending auctions like eBay, there's movies about this, right? It's like this sort of like a cliche in movies, right? These type of auctions can be a little bit more fun for bidders too, and like it's sort of a little bit more lively. Ascending auctions can facilitate collusion, which is an issue to kind of pay attention to, especially if you're taking part in this auction, especially in multi-unit auctions. We'll see this a little bit later. One thing that can also be useful is thinking about reserve prices. So suppose you start the bidding at something greater than zero. This can increase revenue. Importantly, the reservation price should be at least the value of the good to the seller. And usually more, unless there's strong bidding fever-like effects. Why? Because that just might be the price. Like you may have just set the price, and then maybe they're not going to bid above what you set the price at. In common value auctions, well, the seller doesn't necessarily want to increase the number of bidders. Why? Well, we discussed about the winner's curse getting worse than then. With bidder asymmetries, it can be beneficial to try to favor the weak bidders for the reason we were discussing a second ago with the strong bidders. Like this could be ways to try to generate additional revenue. All right, so suppose now thinking about multi-unit auctions. Suppose we're auctioning off K identical units of the product. Well, you've got a lot of different options. Firstly, you could sequentially run K single unit auctions. You could auction off each of these items separately. Or you could simultaneously auction off all the units with a sealed bid auction. So bidders are going to submit multiple bids for multiple items. Other things you could do, so you could have like a first price. You could have like pay your bid auction. You could have a uniform price. Everyone ends up paying the first non-winning bid. You could have a Vickrey auction. So the winner of M units pays the average of the first M non-winning bids, not including their own. This is sort of like the extension of the second price auction to the multi-unit case. You could have a simultaneously ascending auction. So you could have rounds with bids on each object, and then you could have ascending bids or ascending bids on each of the objects. This is kind of like the Vickrey auction analog. Definitely, the multi-unit auctions are more complicated than the single-unit auctions, but a lot of the same ideas we've been discussing end up holding. What I want to do is discuss an even more complicated case. So, thinking about spectrum auctions, right? So this is multi-units. With continually increasing demand for cell phone bandwidth, governments often auction off licenses to transmit signals over bands of the electromagnetic spectrum. Since '94, the U.S. government's raised like over $60 billion through these auctions. This has actually risen like recently with additional spectrum auctions taking place. The licenses typically are based on some location, also some portion of the spectrum. So you could have like a geographical area, New York or Michigan, and then a particular frequency of the spectrum. So the interesting thing is these licenses, therefore, are not identical because there's different populations, different consumer incomes, and different demand structures, but they are interrelated. Definitely having like New York and New Jersey licenses together are better than having like New York and Montana, because you'd rather have like greater coverage over a particular area if what you're doing is spectrum. All right, so this is an example of a multi-unit auction where the items are differentiated but complements to each other. So it's really complicated because there's this coordination problem associated with trying to allocate the licenses in an efficient way, because it'd be like inefficient to have maybe like those auctions to auction off two adjacent licenses to separate companies. It'd be more efficient to have the same seller or say buyer have both of those. So you want to auction in a way that facilitates coordination without collusion, right? Sealed bid auctions, not good. Sequential auctions, probably not good either. So generally what they do is they have multiple round ascending auctions where all the licenses are auctioned off simultaneously. So the basic idea is for every round, the bidders are going to place bids on any or all licenses. At the end of the round, the standing bids for each license are displayed, and then you go to the next round and the auction ends up where there's no more bidding. The problem is the ascending auctions can facilitate collusion. So here's an interesting example. So suppose that consider this example from Germany, 1999. They had 10 blocks to be auctioned off. There's two large bidders, this one, Mannesmann, and T-Mobile. The rule was any new bid had to exceed the existing bid by 10%. So what happens? Mannesmann bids $20 million, Deutschmarks, on blocks 1 to 5. Okay, that's the one they want, obviously. And then 18.18 million million Deutschmarks on blocks 6 through 10. What did T-Mobile do in the second round? Well, look at this. I want you to type this into your calculator. 18.18 times 1.1, right? Increased by 10% gives you like 19.99 or whatever. So it's like just below 20 million. They're essentially trying to invite collusion, right? Another example, 1996-97 in the U.S., part of a multi-license auction. The U.S. West was competing with McLeod for a particular lot. This is a license in Rochester, Minnesota. U.S. West suddenly bids, $300,000 and then $62,000 for two licenses in Iowa that the other bidder was currently the high bidder for, and U.S. had previously shown no prior interest to. And then McLeod drops out of the Rochester market, which gives U.S. West, right, the rights to lot 378 ultimately. Right, so you can see different types of collusion that can be facilitated. And it's kind of a problem, especially if you're trying to take part in one of these auctions. All right, similar auctions can generate very different results. So for instance, 2000 European auctions for Spectrum and third generation cell phones. So like in Germany, in the UK, more than 600 euros per capita revenue. In Austria, 100. Netherlands, 170. Italy, 240. Switzerland, 20. Right? Ultimately, there's a lot of economists working on these problems, trying to come up with better auctions for these settings. And so it's sort of like interesting but complicated area to explore. Other interesting auctions, well, all pay auctions, everybody's paying, penny auctions, buy price auctions, kind of like eBay. So there's a lot of different variants, a lot of different things we can go into with auctions. And at this point, I'll say no more. I'll go to my puppy study break. So here is Ani. Ani loves water, as you can see. Here's Ani. Ani loves water. All right, that's enough of that. Now I want to talk about patents and intellectual property. So I'll talk a little bit about patents because it's relevant for our entrepreneur, presumably thinking about what's patentable. One thing that's really important to observe is the fact that having a patent doesn't mean that you've protected the market. I mean, there's different strategy around patents. Companies like large companies like Apple and Samsung getting these patent battles, and they get a whole bunch of patents covering a whole variety of things, but there's still smartphones and tablets made by multiple companies, right? So the patent is useful, but the patents, first off, ultimately expire. Second off, there's a lot of different ways to make something kind of similar. And so, for instance, like thinking about like the aspects that can be patented, sometimes they're relatively narrow, and there's other things that can, the basic idea is like just because you have a patent doesn't mean that you've got exclusive rights to the market, depending on what the patent is. There's two main types of patents: utility patents and then design patents. So utility patents, any new and useful process, machine, article of manufacture, composition of matter. This is like pharmaceutical, computer hardware functionality. Software, that's kind of there's interesting. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is like patent law and many of the other laws predate technology and software and apps by quite a bit. And so now the legal structure is sort of evolving to catch up. Design patents, so new original ornamental design for an article of manufacture. So think of like an eyeglass frame, watch, computer case, those types of things. In terms of the length, well, utility patents will get you about 20 years and design patents get you about 14 years, right? The basic outline of how the patenting process works, well, do some research, do a patent search for prior applications, write your patent application. You need a description, so precise description of what the innovation is, claims, what's the invention about. The wording is really important. Consult a patent lawyer. So think about like intellectual property attorneys can be really important. Like one of my main advice throughout the course and throughout entrepreneurship in general is you should be in consultation with business attorney for a variety of reasons. But also like if you're doing some type of patenting, for sure you're going to do this with an intellectual property lawyer. There's a filing fee associated. There's examination if the patent is issued, and then there's maintenance fees after it's been issued. Interestingly, the protection is only from the date forward, not retroactive to the filing date. Moreover, the patent process is expensive, can take a long time to complete. Patent pending, right? So patents should not be obtained for transitory inventions. Something will likely be eclipsed by other inventions in the near future because it's just not worth it. As of March 16th, 2013, the U.S. is now first to file like the rest of the world. Previously, U.S. was first to invent. Legal fees suing for infringement can also be very high. So for all these reasons, like patents are useful. If you definitely have something patentable, you want to investigate getting your patent, but it's not like the end all be all end all for getting into for protecting your niche of the market. What is a patentable invention? Well, it's got to be new. It's got to be non-obvious. So it's hard to obtain patent protection for software, right? Or for something very common. It would be really difficult for patent protection for something like seat-side service, as we discussed in like one of the first lectures. This is where they were coming up with an app to match attendees at a performance or stadium with the concession stand to deliver the items to them. Can't patent a law of nature, like a mathematical formula or a natural phenomena. So there's interesting rules around, like especially in biotech, what can be patented and what can't be. Must be useful, not abstract. Proposed machine or transformation test. So either a machine that does something tangible or a process by which something tangible is transformed. There's an interesting recent case, so Bilski 2010, trying to patent a supposed original method of hedging enacted by software. Court doesn't support the machine or transformation test as a be-all end-all rule, but support it as a clue and rules against the Bilski patent based on it being a relatively abstract idea. So there's an important value of physicality, and there seems to be a view against patenting business methods similar to the European Union. Interestingly, you can explore patents via this is here going back to Sally, but you can investigate patents via Google Patent, which can be really interesting. So Google Patents has been super interesting for actually like a lot of economic history research. So economic historian Petra Moser has she's got a like interesting collection of research along like innovation using some of the patenting data. But anyway, so you can find cool things to patent. So for instance, I looked up cloaking device to make objects invisible, and one of the really cool things, I don't know, you kind of play around with that yourself. One of the cool things with like the cloaking invisibility device is like thinking of all the ways to make something invisible. And I think one of my favorite ones, maybe it was that one, I couldn't verify if it is where you have different types of like cameras or pixels to be able to display the background. So when I'm looking at the image of when I'm looking at the object, I'm actually just seeing kind of straight through it. It's making it transparent by virtue of giving me like some type of camera or reflected image of the background, and therefore it'll blend in, which I think is absolutely brilliant. Thinking about the ways that you can make something invisible, it's kind of cool. So at least it is. That's how my mind works. Maybe, I don't know, maybe that's kind of boring. I don't know, whatever. In terms of like other protection, we have copyright. The idea is to protect literary or artistic expression. So think of like books, art, sound. The ideas in the art are not protected. Someone can summarize your work, right? So summaries are not protected, but the literary artistic expression itself is. Protection lasts for the life of the author plus 75 years. Copyrighting your work doesn't require any formal work. Copyright can be registered. It can be done at any time, including after a potential infringement has taken place. On the other hand, this can be really cheap, so $35 to $55, something like this, and does provide evidence of when the work originated if you actually go and copyright, so that you've documented when the work was from. Trademarks are also interesting. So trademark is a name, symbol, or motto identified with a company's product. I should have had plural. I have plural. I should have had possessive, singular possessive. Sorry. Probably wouldn't have even noticed that if I didn't highlight it. Why did I do that? I don't know. Trademarks protect your investments, such as advertising in these names, and then others can't use them, right? So if you're advertising a lot about your name, you've built up this brand recognition, you've built up this reputation. You don't want somebody else free riding in what you've just generated. So you want to trademark whatever is that name. Trademarks can be suggestive of the product, not descriptive, such as like English leather. Other descriptives probably can't be trademarked either, so like breakfast bread or 5-minute glue. On the other hand, if it's accompanied by a personal name, like, I don't know, like Ben's Daddy Toast. I make pumpkin bread. Ben's Daddy Toast would be. So kids like toast, but Daddy Toast has like chocolate chips in it, so pumpkin bread. Yeah. On the other hand, when accompanied by personal names, possibly could be trademarked. Depends kind of what the personal name is, and so on and so forth. Interesting that trademarks can actually be invalidated if they become generic, so like Band-Aid or Kleenex or Rollerblade or aspirin, right? You can look up the existing trademarks, similar as we were looking up patents a second ago, but you can look up on the Trademark Electronic Search System on the USPTO site. The basic process is to file the trademark with the patent and then with the Patent and Trademark Office. Trademarks can be renewed indefinitely. The initial fee, something around the range of like $275 to $400 for 10 years. It's about the same to renew every 10 years. So obviously, if you're gonna go and do this yourself, like I'm give the figures and the date, everything I'm giving. This is sort of like opening our eyes to the fact that these things exist. Like you're gonna go and you're gonna actually look into this, consult with a business attorney, and then verify like what's the present prices and process involved. These things change. I want to give the idea for all these lectures is to think about like how economics can be applied to entrepreneurship and to kind of open our eyes to things that like economic students and people in general may not have thought about, may not have considered until it's like articulated in a video. But anyway, I hope you enjoy the video. I hope you enjoy a collection of my entrepreneurship lectures, and see you next time.